Good evening, everyone. My name's Philip Marshall. I'm director of the London Library, and it's an absolutely great pleasure to introduce you to Tim this evening. But before I do that, I'd like to welcome you all to the library, particularly those of you who have never been to the library before. In fact, maybe you've never even heard of the library before this evening. We have been rather tucked away here in our little corner of St James's Square for the last 170 years. It's a secret that we want to share with you all. So do, those of you who haven't been before, if you'd like to come back for a complimentary tour on another occasion, do please get in touch with us. We'd love to show you around and tell you all about ourselves. The library's got 1 million books, but you may be particularly interested in the fact that we have an incredible history collection here. And I know that that's played its part in Tim's work on his book, Appeasing Hitler. And if you're interested in our speaker events program, you may also be interested to know that on the 8th of May, we have Hallie Rubenhold, who will be talking about the lives of those ladies who were unfortunately killed by Jack the Ripper, and we don't really know very much about. So that will be on the 8th of May if you're interested in that one. But before really introducing Tim, I just wanted to thank you again for coming here and sharing the library with us. Tim has written an astounding book, his first book. He, as you probably know, studied history at Christ College, Oxford, and for 4 years was a political journalist at Channel 4. Sorry, is it working, Nick? He writes regularly for The Observer, the Daily Telegraph and the Spectator. But perhaps most importantly for us, he's a great friend and supporter of the library and has written most of his book, Appeasing Hitler, here at the library. This evening you can buy, if you haven't already, a copy of Appeasing Hitler, and Tim will be pleased to sign it for you downstairs in the issue hall after this evening's talk. And at the end of the talk this evening, Tim will also be very happy to take questions. I would just ask that you wait for the roving mic so that everyone can enjoy hearing the question as well as the answer. So without further ado, I'd like to pass you on to Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip. Can you all hear me? It's wonderful to be here at the London Library, and thank you, Philip. Absolutely everything you say is true. This is honestly my favourite place in the whole of London, and almost every word that is in the book was written here, and almost all of the books that I needed to research the book are found here. And it's not just because the library has a fantastic history collection, it's got a fantastic collection of journalistic writings as well, and it was quite something to be going through the shelves and suddenly seeing a rather strange book which nobody had taken out, I think probably since the author dedicated it to the library in 1935, called Hitler's Wonderland, which was signed by this very right-wing journalist called Michael Fry, and makes an appearance in the book. So if you're not a member, I really do urge you to join. It's a fantastic place. The genesis of this book came when I was reading the diaries of Harold Nicolson. Harold Nicolson, the National Labour MP, who wrote absolutely marvellous diaries. And in May 1938, Nicholson came across 3 young peers in Pratt's Club, just on St James's up the road. This is 2 months after Hitler had invaded Austria. And these 3 young peers, 3 young lords, admitted that they would rather see Hitler in London than have a Labour government. And that was long before Jeremy Corbyn ever became Labour leader. And this I found so shocking that I really wanted to start to investigate quite how widespread support for the Third Reich and the Hitler government was among the British elite. And when I started to try and read about this, I realized that there was a problem, that historians had been unable to gain access to the main aristocratic archives, which would answer that question. If you knock on someone's door and say you want to find out about their sympathies of their grandfather and the Third Reich, you don't tend to get very far. So my advice to you, if you ever want to do research in this field, is you say that you're doing something to do with socio-economic relations between the wars, and make it sound as dry as possible, and then hopefully that will at least get you through the front door. But then as I went on, I realized that it needed to be, and I wanted it to be, a wider book, because I thought that too many of the books which I had read as a schoolboy on this tend to assume that we all know the end of the story, which we do. We all know that the 30s ended in the Second World War. But contemporaries didn't. And reading so many diaries and going back to the diplomatic dispatches and correspondence of contemporaries really captures the moral dilemmas of the period. So that was certainly the aim, and that is what I'm going to hope to convey to you over the next 40 minutes or so. I'm sure you all are very well aware of what appeasement is and what we mean by appeasement, but on the off chance, I thought I'd start by giving a definition. Appeasement was the attempt by the British government, and to a lesser extent the French government, to avoid a Second World War by making reasonable concessions to Adolf Hitler. And the first thing to say about this policy is that in some ways it was eminently reasonable. The First World War was responsible for the deaths of 16.5 million people across the world. 1 million British and Commonwealth soldiers died during the First World War, and I think we have to be very careful not to judge the appeasers too harshly. If we were in their shoes, I think the idea of going to war with the same power a mere 20 years after the so-called war to end all wars, you would do absolutely anything to avoid that. And it's not just on Whitehall where you see the cenotaph, very different. It was put up in 1919, 1 year after the war, but it's not a victory symbol. It is no Arc de Triomphe. It is a symbol of loss. And then in every village and town, school and railway station, if you care to look, you will almost certainly find a war memorial. So the desire to avoid a Second World War was probably the most universal and understandable wish in history. The problem, and the problem which I've tried to explore in the book, and the problem which contemporaries faced, is at what point does your very reasonable desire to avoid that war actually make the war more likely? At what point do you say, this man, Hitler, there is nothing reasonable about him, no concessions are going to be enough, and the sooner that we face up to him, the better? It should be said that when Hitler first came to power in January 1933, if you can't see, because I'm blocking the view, just shout at me. When he came to power in January 1933, a number of people in Britain and across the world were tempted to underestimate him. The Daily Telegraph wondered how a man who looked so uninspiring with, quote, that ridiculous little moustache, could prove so attractive and impressive to the German people, while the Labour Daily Herald scoffed at, quote, the stubby little Austrian with a flabby handshake, shifty brown eyes, and a Charlie Chaplin moustache. Nothing, continued the Herald, in the public career of little Adolf Hitler, highly strung as a girl and vain as a matinee idol, indicates that he can escape the fate of his immediate predecessors. German chancellors between the wars had lasted on average only a year, and most people thought that Germany, still grappling with the cataclysmic effects of the Great Depression and 6 million people unemployed, that Hitler's tenure in the chancellery would be similarly short. Nevertheless, the British and most of the world were deeply shocked by the speed with which Hitler established his dictatorship and began his rule of aggressive persecution. It is sometimes thought that people in the 30s didn't realize quite how nasty the Nazis were until Kristallnacht in November 1938, or indeed after the Second World War when the death camps were liberated. This absolutely was not true. The first nationwide act of persecution occurred in Germany in April 1933, when the Germans enacted a boycott of all Jewish shops and businesses. Dachau concentration camp was set up at the end of March 1933, that is only 2 months after Hitler came to power. And these were very, very well-known events. 40,000 people protested in Hyde Park, and there were about the Jewish boycott, and there were other protests in Manchester, Glasgow, Leeds, and New York. This was very, very well documented and written about, not just in the papers, but also in books. And there were also some people who saw from the very beginning the profound danger that the Hitler regime posed to the security of the world. This man is Britain's first ambassador to Nazi Germany, Sir Horace Rumbled. Now, although Rumbled was described by one contemporary as the ultimate old Etonian, slightly less of an insult then as it might be now, and as English as eggs and bacon, Rumbled was able to foresee the trajectory of a future Hitler government and warned the British government in June 1933 of the extreme danger that Adolf Hitler posed. And Rumbled was able to do this because he had read Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography, come political treatise, published in 1925, written in 1923 when he was in prison after the Beer Hall Putsch. And Rumbled was able to show that this effective murder note before the murder was committed was extremely powerful. Hitler talked about the need to build up the German armed forces, which had been made illegal at the end of the First World War. He talked about the need to conquer Lebensraum, living space in Eastern Europe and particularly in Russia. And he also talked about the need to annihilate, he actually uses the word annihilate, France. The problem is that very few people actually read Mein Kampf in the 1930s. Being a writer, I know a tiny bit about the incredibly complicated and boring problems with copyright. And Hitler, being the author of Mein Kampf, owned the copyright, and he was able to ban all foreign translations for the majority of the 1930s. There was a foreign translation, there was a British translation, and there was a French translation, both of which appeared in 1933, but they were a third the length of the original. So all the bits about, and then I will take over the world, were cut out, and the bits relating to his rather boring time as a bourgeois painter of chocolate boxy pictures in Vienna were left in. The other person, of course, who most famously recognized the extreme danger posed by the National Socialists was this man. Now, we all think of we all think of Churchill as Britain's indomitable war leader, the savior of Western civilization, and possibly the greatest prime minister that we've ever had. But it's important to remember when thinking about the 30s that Churchill was hugely distrusted and widely regarded as a prime minister coming to the end of, not a prime minister, a politician reaching the end of his days. And the reasons for this are simple. He had changed parties, not once but twice. He'd started off life as a Conservative, then joined the Liberals in 1904, then after 20 years joined the Conservatives again. But also because of his disastrous role as First Lord of the Admiralty in the First World War and his authorship of the Gallipoli and Dardanelles campaign. So Churchill's early warnings, which actually began a year before Hitler came to power, his first major warnings about the danger of the Nazis occurred in 1932. Churchill's warnings were largely ignored, and they're ignored because people didn't want to hear them. The British government didn't want to hear them because the British economy was stuck in the morass that was the Great Depression, with millions, 3.5 million at its height, unemployed. And the last thing the British government wanted to do was to start to spend copious amounts of money on arms. The British people didn't want to know about it because there was between 1929 and about 1935 possibly the strongest spirit of pacifism that this country has ever experienced. And it was actually stronger then in the late 1920s and the early 1930s than it was in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. And there's a very interesting reason for that. Many of the seminal texts which we've all seen and read, which appear on the West End stage still, or at cinemas, well, probably not cinemas, All Quiet on the Western Front, or Journey's End, or, yes, cinemas, Vera Britton's Testament of Youth, now a film with Alicia Vikander in it. These memoirs of the First World War were published during this period, and it reminded a younger generation of the horrors of war when they hadn't themselves experienced it. And the young decided that they simply weren't going to put up with any sort of militarism again. And this spirit was most famously captured when students of the Oxford Union voted in February 1933 that they would, under no circumstances, fight for their king and their country. And this was a really deeply shocking thing. Students at Oxford and other universities are perfectly capable of doing very stupid things nowadays and nobody pays any attention. But then it was deeply shocking, and both Hitler and Mussolini commented on this as evidence of British degeneracy. "You British are soft," said one Nazi apparatchik to a Liberal MP when he visited Germany in 1934. It also was not just a policy espoused by dewy-eyed undergraduates, it was official opposition policy. This is George Lansbury, the leader of the Labour Party, who bears, I think, more than a slight resemblance, both in policy and facial terms, to his 21st century successor. And George Lansbury stated, 10 months after Hitler came to power, "I would disband the army and dismiss the air force. I would abolish the whole dreadful equipment of war and say to the world, do your worst." And at the party conference in October 1933, 1 month after Lansbury said that, the party voted in favour of a general strike in the event of war, which would cripple the economy and bring down the government. So these were deeply pacifist times. It should also be said that many people felt that Hitler had a point. By the early 30s, any idea that the Treaty of Versailles, which is summarized by this rather amazing picture from the Hall of Mirrors, any idea that the Treaty of Versailles was a guarantor of European peace and stability had been abandoned. And this came about through the propaganda efforts of the German government, who throughout the 1920s made a very significant push to convince the world that they had been harshly treated at Versailles, but also by Britain's own civil servants. John Maynard Keynes, the liberal economist, was a Treasury civil servant who was part of the delegation to the Versailles Conference in 1919, and he wrote a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And I don't think that there has ever been a book which has got a more boring title, which has had a greater impact on the world. The economics of the peace sold like hotcakes, and it convinced people that the Allies had indeed been overly punitive on poor little Germany. They had imposed ruinous reparations. Actually, Germany never paid most of the reparations. They had amputated parts of German territory for the benefit of new countries like Poland, and they had confiscated her colonies and forbidden her to have the main accoutrements of a military, such as an air force, submarines, ships beyond a certain tonnage, and only an army of 100,000 men. So there was a deep sense of guilt that the Allies were somehow to blame for the state that Germany found herself in, and in some reason to blame for Adolf Hitler. The idea that Britain was responsible, or Britain and France were responsible for the Nazis, was fairly widespread by the early 30s. And so some people thought that they needed to do something about it. This is Lord Lothian, who was, as you can see, is one of the few people who did actually read Mein Kampf. Not that it did him any good. He was wrong about just about everything during the entire period. And he was a liberal. He was a committed Christian socialist and just generally pretty much a rum cove, as Stanley Baldwin described him. And Lothian convinced himself, and tried to convince as many other people as possible, that what Germany was seeking was not arms and territory, but status, equality, rights, justice. And if only we gave this to poor little Germany and her very reasonable Chancellor Adolf Hitler, who he met on a number of occasions, then all would be right in the world. Now, Lothian is a man from the sort of centre ground of British politics, and there were other members of the left in British politics who took a similar view of the plight of Germany. The right also felt that the Germans needed to be appeased, but for slightly different reasons. The fear of communism was an incredible spur to the upper classes and the ruling elite of Britain, who felt that the Germans and Adolf Hitler were really quite a frightfully good thing there, because they were stopping the bestial hordes of Slavic Bolsheviks from sweeping further westwards, and that is why Winston Churchill, as well as other leading figures of the British political elite, including Sir Austen Chamberlain, praised Mussolini when he came to power in 1922 and defeated the rather vague threat of communism in Italy, and why many people supported Hitler during the 1930s. And I'm just going to read you a tiny bit from a couple of quotations which illustrate this. This is what Lady Nellie Cecil, who was wife of Viscount Cecil, Lord Cecil of Chelwood, and daughter of the Earl of Durham, wrote in 1936. "Nearly all my relations are tender towards Mussolini and to the Nazis and idiotic about communism," she wrote. And later she decided to create a file of correspondence under the label "An Attempt, Unsuccessful, to persuade leading conservatives in society to show German visitors that political and religious persecution, imprisonment without trial, murder and torture are not social recommendations in this country. Douglas Reed, the Central European correspondent for The Times, observed that class prejudice and property obsession had turned the snobs fascist. And as I've already said, it was Harold Nicholson who came across 3 young peers who said that they would rather find Hitler in London than have a Labour government. Shortly after that entry in his diary, Nicholson wrote, "People of the governing classes think only of their own fortunes, which means hatred of the Reds. This creates a perfectly artificial, but at present most effective secret bond between ourselves and Hitler. Our class interests on both sides cut across our national interests." It should also be pointed out that none of these people, Lord Lothian or the people, the fellow travellers of the right, which included the proprietor of the Daily Mail, Lord Rothermere, or the former Air Minister, Lord Londonderry, none of these people had any sort of official encouragement or credentials whatsoever. And it's one of the most extraordinary features of the appeasement years, and something which I've tried to go into a lot of detail in the book, because I can't think of another period where this happened. I don't know, whatever you think of the Brexit negotiations, we have at least been spared the sight of the Duke of so-and-so or Lord such-and-such going off to have separate discussions and negotiations with Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk. It has at least been conducted between the EU and the British government. Whereas here, all sorts of rather eccentric individuals, simply because they had titles, charged over to Germany and began their own private diplomacy. And I go into quite a few reasons as to why they did this. It wasn't just that they were terrified of communism and desperate to avoid a Second World War. If you happen to be a large landowner, then the only thing you probably care about more than a war is a communist revolution, which is going to take your wealth away from you. But also because these people had been largely ignored by the British political elite. The aristocrats, which were causing all these problems in the 1930s, had come of age when Lord Salisbury was Prime Minister. But by the time they're in their 50s and their 60s, it's Stanley Baldwin, the son of an ironmonger, and Neville Chamberlain, the son of a screw manufacturer. And they're ignored, they're shut out. Just because you are a landowner or a duke or a lord or an earl or a marquis, you don't have political power in Britain. But the Nazis didn't realize this. The Nazis thought that because you had a title, or indeed if you were the king, you had enormous political power. And so they courted them, and an awful lot of these people were hugely flattered by the reception that they received in Germany. I mean, some of them, it also should be said, were frankly in awe of what I would describe as the noxious glamour of the Third Reich. This is a man called Ernest Tennant, who was a merchant banker who visited Nazi Germany almost every year between 1933 and 1939 and acted as a sort of travel agent for the regime. And when he visited the Nuremberg rally in 1935, he wrote in a letter home, "None of the great war kings of the past, from Xerxes to the Kaiser, ever dreamt of such pomp and pageantry as Hitler's organizers at Nuremberg have made a matter of annual routine. What I saw in Nuremberg has altered none of my opinions about the steady progress of Germany and the vital importance of Anglo-German friendship. Possibly, if the present regime survives, we're witnessing the birth of a super race." And it was quite good fun for some people. If you were of the sort of frivolous sort, like a Mitford girl or whatever, you could go and have a vaguely jolly time with the Nazis if that was your thing. The British government tried to have their own diplomacy, slightly less frivolous, but this didn't get anywhere. And it didn't get anywhere because every time they felt that they were about to get onto a deal, every time they thought that they were going to try and persuade Hitler to sign up to some new agreement which would replace the Versailles Treaty, Hitler initiated one of his coups. And here you can see, that is Lord Londonderry, talking about the amateur diplomats. That's Lord Londonderry on the left, Hitler, and the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. But here is Hitler in the Reich Chancellery with Anthony Eden, who was Lord Privy Seal and Deputy Foreign Secretary, future Prime Minister, and Sir John Simon. Sir John Simon, probably the worst Foreign Secretary in modern times, were it not for some more recent incumbents. John Simon's grandchildren are very, very happy that Boris Johnson came along. And one of Sir John Simon's civil servants said that the only foreigners I think he really understands are the ancient Greeks. He was a fairly typical classicist in that regard. This meeting is extremely controversial, and it's controversial because it is occurring only 5 days after Hitler has initiated conscription in Germany. The Versailles Peace insisted that the Germans were only allowed 100,000 men, an army of 100,000 men. Hitler says he wants to have an army of 500,000 men. And the British, and he says this on the eve of a major diplomatic summit, when the British Foreign Secretary and his deputy are meant to be meeting him. Naturally, Britain's allies, which at that time included Italy, but also most crucially France, assume that the British will cancel the trip. Can't possibly go out there at the time that Hitler's torn up a major part of the Versailles settlement. But on the contrary, they continue to go, and this causes huge rift, and this is one of the many examples where Britain really lets down her allies and helps convince Mussolini, at any rate, that we will never stand up to Hitler. And the British continue with this because they think that an arms agreement and some sort of Eastern Pact which will guarantee Germany's eastern borders can be arrived at. Needless to say, none of this happens, and it's a very fractious time that they have there in Germany. The only moment of light relief comes during the banquet on the evening of this, that this photograph was taken, when Hitler is sitting opposite Anthony Eden, and it transpires that it is the anniversary of the last German offensive during the First World War. And both Anthony Eden and Hitler were veterans of the First World War. Not only that, they served almost exactly opposite each other during this battle. And they signed a map which they drew on a napkin to commemorate the fact that they had both fought opposite each other in the last battle of the First World War. And after the meal, the French ambassador came rushing up to Eden and said, Minister, is it true you were really opposite Hitler in 1918? And Anthony Eden, a little embarrassed, said, well, it would appear so. And you missed him? That's the Frenchman. You deserve to be shot. The next coup to occur actually is not Hitler's. It's his southern dictator friend, Benito Mussolini, who in October 1935 invades the kingdom of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. Now, the Abyssinian crisis is significant to our story for two reasons. Firstly, it puts to the test, the ultimate test, that supreme creation of the post-war settlement, the League of Nations. The League of Nations was held up as this forum which was going to prevent war. And although it had been severely tested and found wanting when the Japanese had invaded the Chinese province of Manchuria 5 years earlier, this was a crisis far closer to home. And as to whether or not the League survived, all depended on the response of the nations, who were all bound by something called Article 16, which is a bit like NATO, which essentially said that an attack on any one member of the League was an attack on all of them, and they had to bound themselves together in something called collective security. So there had to be a collective response. There was a collective response, but it wasn't a very good response. The League imposed sanctions, led by Britain and France, but the sanctions weren't terribly punitive, to say the least. The French managed to ban the export of pâté de foie gras to Italy, but not steel, coal, oil, or pig iron, anything that you actually needed to fight a war. The British could have easily stopped Mussolini, and this is, we can talk about this later if you like, this is, I think, one of the turning points. This would have been a very easy moment to send a signal to the dictators that we weren't going to be pushed around and allow international acts of piracy and brigandage to occur. The Italians, God bless them, are not known for their fighting prowess, and the Royal Navy, as it proved during the Second World War, was more than capable of defeating the Italian Navy, and in 1935 could have quite simply blockaded the Suez Canal, thus preventing the supply of Italian troops to, sorry, gone too far, gone backwards, through Eritrea and Italian Somaliland to Abyssinia. And there you can see Abyssinian cavalry going out to meet the planes of the fascist Italian troops, and the planes broke the Geneva Convention and deployed mustard gas against the Italians. Mustard gas not used during battles of the Second World War, but was used during the Abyssinian campaign. And the failure of the British and the French to stand up to Mussolini in 1935, 1936 is significant because it destroys the League of Nations, this means by which an alliance against Nazi Germany could have been forged, has gone. And secondly, it shows Hitler what can be achieved by naked aggression. And it's only a few months before Hitler, in March 1936, has launched his own coup, the remilitarization of the Rhineland. The Rhineland, that area of northwest Germany on the French-Belgian frontier, which had been demilitarized at the Versailles Conference, because this was a doorway through which the French army, the strongest army in Central and Western Europe, could march to take down a German government which was threatening the peace. So the remilitarization of the Rhineland had serious consequences for the future of European stability. Why didn't the British and the French do something about this? It had been warned about, it had been a major tenet of Versailles that this was something which was necessary for Western security. The French wanted to occupy it. The British said, no, you can't occupy it, we'll just demilitarize it. Well, in France, the trauma of the First World War was even greater than in Britain, for fairly obvious reasons. It happened on their territory, more people died. And the French General Staff were incredibly defeatist. And the French Chief of the General Staff, General Maurice Gamelin, essentially lies to the French cabinet. Only 22,000 German troops crossed into the demilitarized zone. They could have easily been pushed out by the French army. But Gamelin says, no, it's not 22,000, it's 322,000. And so he terrifies the French cabinet, who, by the way, are involved in a major political crisis. If you think that we are living through turbulent political times in this country at the moment, I invite you to look at the Third Republic of France during the 1930s. Prime ministers lasted on average 4 months in France in the years between the First and the Second World War. It was an absolute basket case. So that's why the French don't go. The British don't want to get involved because they are terrified of war, but also because they don't see a reason to get involved. The Rhineland is German territory, and what on earth is the point of sending your sons and fathers and fiancés, husbands, to fight in a war to kick the Germans out of their own territory? And this point is brought home to Anthony Eden, who by this stage has become Foreign Secretary, when he asks what his taxi driver thinks about this. If you ever want to have a sensible view of what's going on in the world, ask your taxi driver. And that is what Anthony Eden did. And the reply came, well, I suppose Jerry can do what he likes in his own back garden. The pace of our story, and hopefully the book, increases when this man becomes Prime Minister in May 1937. I really, really wish the Prime Minister still dressed like this. And definitely the best thing about Neville Chamberlain was that he was a passionate fisherman. In fact, almost all, I tried to write an article about this for Country Life, but they didn't seem to want it. The fact that, very short-sighted of them, the fact that almost every single coup that occurs during the 30s, Chamberlain is either on the riverbank or on a grouse moor. And people genuinely joked in Germany that Hitler timed his coups for weekends due to the British reverence for weekends and the fact that these were totally sacred. And there are fantastic letters from Chamberlain saying, he does say, those damn Germans have spoiled another weekend's fishing. But Chamberlain is actually a very serious man. Those make him sound rather buffoonish. He wasn't a buffoon. He was a very serious man with a very serious mission. His first sense of mission was entirely reasonable, which was that Britain must reduce the number of her potential enemies. The British Empire, although actually larger than it had ever been in the 1930s, thanks to the colonies which were taken over after the First World War from the defeated powers, was in visible decline, and the economy was still suffering as a result of the Great Depression. Britain could not possibly face the combined might of Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, and Nazi Germany together. So he quite legitimately decides that diplomacy must reduce the number of our potential enemies. He also believes that British policy has been too desultory, it has been too reactive, and we've just simply been waiting for each crisis to occur and then not doing very much about it. He thinks that if you go out and say to Hitler very straightforwardly, what do you actually want, and then work out some sort of deal, then maybe an accommodation which could secure peace could be reached at. And he also thinks that the approach that he envisages is a particularly personal one. He writes to a relation in January 1938, "The dictators are too often regarded as though they were entirely inhuman. I believe this idea to be quite erroneous. It is indeed the human side of the dictators which makes them dangerous, but on the other hand, it is on this side which they can be approached with the greatest hope of successful issue." And he doesn't waste much time. in November 1937, Lord Halifax, who's the gentleman in the bowler hat, goes out to visit Adolf Hitler. Lord Halifax is number 2 at the Foreign Office and Lord Privy Seal, and he's essentially gone out there to find out what Hitler wants from Europe, and it's an expression of goodwill. Again, keeping with the country sports themes, his pretext for visiting Germany is that he's gone to shoot foxes in Pomerania, which, as a master of foxhounds in Yorkshire, he thought was distinctly caddish way of dealing with the fox, but he didn't mention that. And the trip, it should be said, almost started in disaster when Halifax, quite unbelievably, arrives at the Berghof. This is the Berghof in Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, Hitler's mountain retreat, and the car arrives at the bottom of those snow-covered steps, and Hitler is waiting for Halifax to get out. And Halifax gets out, and as he's getting out, he fails to recognize Hitler, which I found when I first read this completely astonishing. Hitler, easily the most famous man in the world. And I thought that when I first saw this in fact, someone else's book, because it's fairly well known, I've then discovered, I thought, well, this author's gone way over the top with dramatic license. Can't possibly be true. And I couldn't find a primary source for it. And then I finally found that it's in Halifax's own autobiography. He confesses to it himself. He says, well, I naturally assumed that this chap with rather naff black trousers and patent leather shoes was a footman. And fortunately, the German foreign minister at the time, von Neurath, is able to hiss in his ear, "Der Führer, der Führer," just as Halifax is about to give Hitler his hat and coat. So, I mean, there are moments in this whole story which you wonder if they've been written by P.G. Wodehouse. And Halifax is a natural appeaser. He's quite a cynical and unattractive character in this. He writes before he goes out on this mission that I cannot myself doubt that these fellows, the Nazis, I cannot doubt that these fellows are genuine haters of communism, and I dare say if we were in their position we might feel the same. And he, in the same letter, admitted that he could not find it in himself to condemn nationalism or even racialism as in any way unnatural or immoral. From Hitler's perspective, Halifax gives 2 crucial things away. He tells Hitler, in total contravention of the instructions he's been given by the Foreign Office and his boss, Anthony Eden, that the British do not mind if the Nazis take over Austria or incorporate the Sudeten Germans of the western fringe of Czechoslovakia, provided that it is done peacefully. And in some ways this is an understandable statement. Central and Eastern Europe have never been traditional British concerns. We're a maritime and imperial power. But what Halifax was ignoring, and what the anti-appeasers, foremost among them Winston Churchill, kept on pointing out, was that it has always been a traditional British policy to prevent any one power from dominating the continent. And that is why we opposed the ambitions of Louis XIV in the 17th century, why we opposed the ambitions of the French revolutionary nation and Napoleon in the early 19th century, why we opposed the Kaiserreich in the early 20th century, and why we eventually opposed the Third Reich between 1939 and 1945. Unsurprisingly, Hitler views this as a sign of weakness, and it's not very many months before he is in Vienna to great acclaim. Once the Nazis are in Vienna, there's no hope of getting them out. It's entirely peaceful. There's, short of declaring war, there's nothing that the British or French can really do. Quite typically, the French are without a government at the time that Hitler marches in, and it's over a weekend. Chamberlain was hoping to be fishing, I think. But what it does is it concentrates minds. It is very clear, once Hitler has moved into Austria, where his next target will be. I don't know how well you can see this map at the back or even at the front, but Austria being here, Czechoslovakia, this country which looks a bit like a pancreas, sticking into the side of Germany, and this shaded fringe, which is known as the Sudetenland, contained some 3.25 million ethnic Germans. Germans who actually had never been part of modern-day Germany. They had previously been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But nevertheless, they're being razzled up by Hitler and the sort of quasi-local Nazi party to demand incorporation into the Reich. Why does Czechoslovakia matter much more than Austria? And why is there a crisis over this which almost tips the world into war, which didn't happen in March 1938 when the Anschluss happened? 2 reasons. One, the Czechs make it very clear that they are going to fight. They're not going to roll over like the Austrians. They're very proud. They are going to fight. And secondly, because Czechoslovakia has two important allies. The French have an alliance with Czechoslovakia, and the British have an alliance with the French. The Czechs also have an alliance with the Soviet Union, although there is a crucial clause in the alliance which says that the Soviet Union is only required to come to the aid of the Czechs once the French have first become involved. And the Soviets place great store by this, because the Soviets are terrified of the idea of the Western capitalist powers trying to trick them into a war against Nazi Germany, and they had a certain amount of reason to be so paranoid. Stanley Baldwin, when he was Prime Minister, was not the only person to say, if there's any fighting, I hope it will be between the Nazis and the Bolsheviks. People thought they'd be quite nice to have these two deeply unpleasant regimes slog it out between them and leave us all on the fringes. So the Russians were deeply paranoid, but they had a certain amount of justification. And there you can sort of see a tiny bit more closely the Sudetenland. So throughout the summer of 1938, the German military build-up along the western front of Czechoslovakia makes it fairly clear that the world is heading towards a crisis, and the French keep on saying that they are going to support the Czechs, and the British rely on what they call the guessing position. The guessing position is whereby, it's not a very noble strategy, it wasn't even a very clever strategy, but it was essentially whereby we kept on telling the Czechs that we weren't going to help them if it came to war, and kept on telling the Germans that we might help them if it came to the war. So the idea was try and keep them both guessing, and with the sort of strange idea that if we told the Czechs that we were going to support them, that they were going to get really belligerent and start marching towards Berlin or something like that. It wasn't, however, really about the rights and wrongs of the Sudeten Germans, who a lot of people thought had a right, should they wish to join with Germany, because, after all, President Wilson at the Versailles Conference had determined that self-determination was one of the principles of the new European order. If a people wanted to join with another country who they were ethnically tied to, then why not? And the British had a lot of sympathy for that. Curiously, they didn't seem to think it applied to their own empire, but they were quite happy for it to apply to other parts of the world. But it wasn't really about this. It was about the principle of might versus right, the fact that Hitler was threatening the world with war unless he got his way, and a sense of, at what stage will this man ever stop? Does he just want the Sudeten Germans, or does he want the whole of Czechoslovakia? Is he a more sinister Napoleon, looking for a place of hegemony within Europe? And in, again, wonderfully literary style, the dilemma was summed up by Harold Nicolson, who wrote that he, Chamberlain, would like to give Germany all she wants at the moment, and cannot see that if we make this surrender, we shall be unable to resist other demands. If we assuage the German alligator with fish from other ponds, she will wax so fat that she will demand fish from our own ponds, and we shall not by then be powerful enough to resist. Chamberlain is worried, but he also has a plan, and his plan, which he enacts on the 15th of September 1938, is to fly to Germany and intercede with Hitler to keep the peace. And it's very hard to overstate how dramatic a gesture this was. Everyone thought it was his first flight. It actually wasn't. He had briefly flown over the top of Birmingham in 1923 on a sort of circular tour, but I don't think that really counts. And most people didn't know this. So everyone thought this was his first flight. He was a 69-year-old premier in the days when people did not fly to see foreign leaders, and certainly didn't go by aeroplane if they did. And he goes to see Hitler, and here you can see him having some fairly difficult small talk with the Führer at Berchtesgaden. And Chamberlain essentially concedes to Hitler all that Hitler wants. As he wrote to his sister afterwards, my personal opinion was that on principle I don't care two hoots whether the Sudetens are in the Reich or out of it. And so he concedes to Hitler the idea that the Sudetens may join with the Reich, provided that there is some sort of apparatus to let it be done legally. He suggests a plebiscite or referendum. Referendums were extremely popular techniques used by demagogues in those days. And most crucially, Chamberlain convinces himself that he has somehow won Hitler's confidence, that he comes back to the British cabinet and says he's met this man and he trusts him. He says that there is no way that this man would ever break a bond he's made with another head of state. And this is really the fatal delusion of Chamberlain. And it's not just Chamberlain. Chamberlain made it most cataclysmically with respect to Nazi Germany, but lots of adept politicians somehow believe that their own charm and diplomatic skills can overcome national interests. For a brief moment, the British think that they are going to go to war, but ultimately it is settled by the Munich Conference, and here you can see all the protagonists. Chamberlain on the far left, Edward Daladier, the French Prime Minister who's looking distinctly unhappy, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and Mussolini's son-in-law and foreign minister, Count Czarno. Crucially, you will notice that the Czechs were not at the Munich Conference, which surrendered almost a third of their territory and population, all of their armaments, most of their natural resources, all their fortifications. They weren't represented. They were allowed to attend as observers, but that was a real euphemism because they weren't allowed to observe anything. They landed at Munich airport where they were met by the Gestapo. They were taken to the British hotel. They were locked in a room. They weren't allowed to telephone to Prague. And then in the middle of the night, their allies, the British and the French, turned up and told them that they had completely sold them out. Also not present were the Russians, who deeply resented this and further convinced Stalin that the Western powers could not be trusted. However, the threat of war being averted leads to enormous joy in Britain, and it's hugely important to remember how enormously popular the Munich Agreement was, and the fact that all these people who had been trying on gas masks and digging trenches in Hyde Park now weren't going to have to face what people thought would be a major bombing campaign. People in the 1930s thought about a bombing campaign in much the same way that people in the 60s thought about nuclear war. People thought that London would be destroyed in 2 weeks. Churchill said that 40 to 50,000 people would die a week. In fact, 44,000 people died during the course of the entire Blitz. Estimations of the damage that bombs could do was seriously over the top, but people believed it, and it made the fear of war all the greater. And Chamberlain arrives back and is greeted as a hero by some of the population, but not necessarily by others. And if this, some of this may sound familiar to times we're living in now, but the popular novelist Barbara Cartland, whose brother was a Tory MP, wrote that feeling ran high over the whole country. People who were ordinarily calm and unpolitically minded lost their tempers, were furious with those who disagreed with them, rude and offensive at the slightest provocation. Or Lady Diana Cooper, whose husband Duff Cooper resigned over the Munich Agreement, one of the only cabinet minister to resign over the issue. Husbands and wives stopped speaking to one another. Fathers and sons said unforgivable things to one another, she wrote. So it was a deeply controversial time, and although the consensus, certainly until Hitler violated the Munich Agreement, was that Chamberlain had saved the world from an enormous danger. And there you see the crowds in Downing Street and Chamberlain waving out of the window, and it is from this moment, out of the window of Downing Street, that he makes what was probably the most famous false promise in history. He tells the people that he has not just brought back peace with honor from Germany, he has brought back peace for our time. And it was that phrase which, to this day, continues to hang around his neck. The Munich Agreement was and remains possibly the most controversial international agreement ever negotiated. For the Czechs, it was an undoubted disaster. They lost all the things that I've just mentioned and were, in effect, in the real sense, a vassal state. There was nothing to stop the Germans taking over the rest of Czechoslovakia once the Sudetenland had been ceded to Hitler. Now, the principal defense of Munich has rested on the idea that Britain and France, the Western powers, were not in a position militarily to confront Adolf Hitler and the Wehrmacht in 1938. And it is certainly true that the rearmament program, which had begun in 1936, was nowhere near completion. The Spitfires, Hurricanes, radar, all of which made the difference between victory and defeat in the Battle of Britain, were not ready in 1938, but were ready in 1939. The problem with this argument is that the Germans were not in any position to wage a long-range strategic bombing campaign in 1938. The majority of the Luftwaffe was arrayed along the Czech border and needed to take part in operations to defeat the very formidable Czech army. And as events were later to prove, Hitler had to defeat France and secure airfields along the Channel coast before anybody could think about bombing London or English cities. The other problem with this argument is that the so-called breathing space, the breathing space which Chamberlain was said to have bought at Munich, was an argument which nobody made at the time. It was only made after Chamberlain was shown to have been effectively duped by Hitler. And then people started saying, well, you bought us a year for rearmament. At the time, Chamberlain came back and really did believe he had brought back peace. A number of his cabinet ministers, including Lord Halifax, said to him effectively, you've been very lucky. This man is not going to stop now. This is not going to be the last crisis. You must expedite and accelerate British rearmament massively. And Chamberlain refuses. He says, I've brought back peace. I don't need to do this. And it is not until late spring, early summer 1939 that major efforts are made to increase British rearmament. The Germans, on the other hand, are extremely busy between the years 1938 and 1939, and the Germans managed to out-rearm Britain and France during this period. So the whole idea that we were in a better position militarily in 1939 compared to the Germans is not really something that could be held up to much scrutiny. Strategically, we were in an even worse position. The major advantage that Hitler had throughout the 30s is that he was able to divide and conquer. He was able to pick off each of his victims one after one. There was a very large possibility of an anti-Nazi, anti-fascist coalition from the beginning, but nobody was prepared to take this. One of the reasons being the idea that the First World War had broken out because of a system of alliances. So we're going to get rid of alliances and therefore we won't have a war. Equally, people thought that if we got rid of weapons, we wouldn't have a war. And so by signing the Munich Agreement, Chamberlain loses the chance to bind Czechoslovakia, France, and most crucially the Soviet Union into an anti-Nazi alliance. And it's not long before Stalin begins to think about the obvious alternative to an alliance with the West, which is an alliance with the Nazis. Crucially also, it didn't work. No, sorry, those are Brits in Hyde Park digging trenches. In March 1939, the Germans marched into Prague. They took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. These are German soldiers entering the grounds of the Hradčany Castle. And all of Hitler's promises were shown to have been not worth the paper, the famous piece of paper which Chamberlain waved, which had been written on. The final defense of appeasement and of the Munich Agreement was that it wasn't until this event that anybody could say that Hitler could not be trusted. It was a reasonable policy worth trying, is what they said, and that Hitler should be taken at his word until he proved that he couldn't be. But in fact, Hitler had proved himself long before this time as a serial liar. Not only were his ambitions set out in Mein Kampf and fairly obvious to an awful lot of people who did bother to visit Germany and not get sucked in by the glamour of the regime. After all, these people did go around with skull and crossbones on their caps. But Hitler had promised not to increase the German army beyond the level of his neighbors, but then refused to sign an agreement which would level continental armies at 200,000 men. He had then promised that he would honor the Treaty of Locarno and never enter the remilitarized Rhineland. When he entered the Rhineland, he said that he had no interest in taking over Austria. When he entered Austria, he said that he had no interest in the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. And when he took over, when the Czech crisis was going on in September 1938, he said that he was only interested in incorporating ethnic Germans into the Reich. The mendacity of the man could and was proven long before the Ides of March in 1939. And if there is one major lesson that I think can be taken from this, it is the need to understand the nature of the regime and the nature of the man with whom you are dealing. Appeasement could have been a reasonable and enlightened policy, but it could never have been a reasoned and enlightened policy with Adolf Hitler in charge. Thank you very much. Very, very happy to take any questions or corrections or abuse. Yes, sir.
Very interesting indeed. Just a little footnote. The key question often with these hindsight stories is how much could one know at the time? Quite early on in your talk, you mentioned that already in 1933 there was anti-Jewish actions in Germany, and this was widely covered. I've just finished reading a book here from the library by Erich Kästner, who was writing about his wartime experiences. And he was saying even dictators like Hitler had to take things at a pace that their country could cope with. He said the anti-Jewish initiative of 1933 was a complete failure because people boycotted it because it was too early. And he had to let the anti-Jewish sentiment slowly build up so that finally in 1938 it could have the complete success that it did, success in quotes of course, of the Kristallnacht. So yes, it's true that something did happen already in 1933, but by the Germans themselves it was regarded as something that just wasn't representative yet of the regime.
Yes, I think that I'm sure that's true. Regardless, however, what I would say of how successful the Nazis and the German government viewed it, the reaction here was extremely, and in other parts of the world was extremely strong, and this was increased by Jewish refugees fleeing from Germany, including some very famous people, in Albert Einstein, composers Bruno Walter, Otto Klemperer, and others. It created a really, really shocking effect, and even there was an awful lot of anti-Semitism among the British upper classes, something which I've gone into a lot of detail here. But even people who were guilty of parlor anti-Semitism, something which we would all find disgusting and hugely offensive today, were shocked by the German treatment of the Jews. And people like Lord Londonderry, who visited Hitler on a number of occasions and quote-unquote said, "I have personally no great affection for the Jews," wrote to Goering and Himmler and said that the greatest obstacle of an Anglo-German alliance or Anglo-German friendship was the German persecution of the Jews. The British could not understand it, and one of the reasons being that there were far fewer Jews in this country than there were on the continent. So, however unsuccessful the boycott might have been from the Nazi point of view, the anti-Jewish measures were felt very strongly and resented in the liberal democracies. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you might comment on the subject of intelligence, and Chamberlain in particular. I've heard it said that Chamberlain wasn't very impressed by intelligence, rather ignored it, which is great contrast to Winston Churchill, who was absolute demon with intelligence, and actually used intelligence in order to look at intentions of the Germans, whereas Chamberlain and Baldwin, for that matter, spent a lot of time looking at capability, never quite getting the sums right, and never really creating an intelligence service which could actually get to the bottom of what Hitler really thought, and then they might well have found something which would have told them that they were barking up the wrong tree.
Completely right. Chamberlain was a dogmatist, and he really didn't want to hear any inconvenient facts that didn't suit his own theory. This isn't intelligence, but it was an analysis of the regime. One of the most famous books, which I read here, and copies of it are in the library, was a book called The House That Hitler Built by Stephen H. Roberts, and this was an Australian historian who spent an awful lot of time traveling around Germany in the mid-1930s, and he stated emphatically that the Hitler government could not achieve its aims without war. And this book was a major bestseller, and it was read by Chamberlain. And in January 1938, Chamberlain wrote to his sisters and said, "If I accepted the author's conclusions, I would despair, but I don't and won't." He was incredibly stubborn about this, and there was a huge amount of intelligence which he refused to accept because, well, there was one slightly legitimate reason, that they kept on getting the timing wrong. The intelligence never got the issue wrong. They never got the idea that Hitler was going to, they never thought he was going to invade Papua New Guinea. They always knew which country was next, but they kept on getting the timing of it slightly wrong. And in the end, the intelligence services were forced to putting in to their reports the insults which Hitler was reported to have said of Chamberlain to get him to pay attention. They wrote in one report to get him to really sit up and pay attention that Hitler was apparently referring to him as the English arsehole. And that did cause a certain amount of shock. Yes.
I just wondered if you could talk a little about how important you felt the Spanish Civil War was in terms of appeasement, because obviously Britain led the way on the non-intervention pact, to which Hitler turned a hugely blind eye, and Franco would have got nowhere without Hitler and Mussolini. So what could you say about that?
Well, the Spanish Civil War is a slightly less, because it involves the League of Nations in a less important way, a less important version of the Rhineland. Once again, it shows that the British and French aren't going to do anything, but it is slightly separate because it is a civil war, and the British are very divided as to which side they want support. For the left and the Labour Party, it is the great cause, and the Labour Party get terribly exercised about the idea that we should be supporting the Republicans, although, as some members of the Conservative Party point out to them, that if it was left to their way, Britain would have no weapons with which to support the Republicans or confront any fascists across the world. So, again, it is another instance, and was cited by civil servants at the time, of the weakness of the British position, but I'm not sure what could have been achieved by involving ourselves in the Spanish cauldron at that time. Yes, sir.
Thank you. At what point could the Western democracies have stopped Hitler, and what would be the nature of, what would they have done to oppose Hitler? Would it have been an invasion of Germany or an economic blockade at the various times that these opportunities arose?
That is, of course, the million-dollar question. And the answer is, the only time I think that a Second World War could have been avoided would be if the French army had indeed pushed in to the Rhineland in March 1936 and expelled the Germans. Hitler had seriously gambled. His generals had told him not to do it, and this would have been a serious setback. Every time, what also needs to be remembered, every time that one of these coups happens, the British and the French do nothing, it increases Hitler's own personal prestige, and he also convinces himself of his own invincibility. His own faith in his star increases the entire time. However, I don't think that there was ever the slightest realistic possibility of the French and British getting involved in 1936 for the reasons I mentioned earlier, the defeatism of the French General Staff and the lack of a cause to go to war, a lack of casus belli for the British. So I don't argue in the book, and I'm not here to say that the Second World War could have necessarily been avoided. I don't believe that anything is inevitable, and I think even in 1938 there were ways in which Hitler could have been made to have pause for thought. In fact, he did. He had cold feet. He was all geared up. He wanted a war in 1938 to conquer the whole of Czechoslovakia, and he was convinced that Britain and France wouldn't intervene. And at the last moment, he did get cold feet, and he himself agreed to call the Munich conference. This showed that this man could be faced down. Nevertheless, if the British and the French had stood up to him in 1938, maybe the war would have been delayed, but it probably wouldn't have been avoided. So my argument more is not necessarily that an entire war could have been avoided, but that it could have been fought under far more favourable circumstances, and that the policy of appeasement really didn't achieve very much, aside from humiliating us. Yes, sir.
Thanks. You spoke about the sympathies of classes towards what Hitler represented towards the beginning of the talk. And then at the end, you told us, or further on, you told us a lot about the strategies and actions of the government, later in the 1930s, leading up to 1938. But are we to take it that did the former have any influence on the latter?
It didn't have. It had influence in the sense that it affected mindsets, the general mindset that these Germans had a cause. I don't think the government itself was not really affected by any affection or admiration for Nazi Germany, and didn't sort of take part in all the jamborees around the Berlin Olympics, for instance. But it actually caused far more problems on the German side, because it convinced the Germans that the British were desperate to avoid a war, because all these people kept on going out there and saying that we were, and that we were desperate to be friends with them. And it also convinced the Germans that foreign policy in this country was not made in the Foreign Office in Downing Street, but was made in aristocratic drawing rooms. And one of the most famous instances of this was that Hitler's reaction to the abdication crisis. Hitler was convinced that Edward VIII did not abdicate because of love of Wallace Simpson. He had been pushed out because he was a pro-German monarch who sympathized with the Nazis, and he'd been pushed out by an anti-German British political class. And he wrote to his ambassador, von Ribbentrop, here, saying, you might as well come home now. There's no point negotiating with these people. Now they've deposed the king, there's no point. And Ribbentrop fed into this. So the detrimental effect of the amateur diplomats and the sympathies of large swathes of the English ruling elite towards Nazi Germany were, I think, mainly due to the misconceptions they gave the Germans rather than the false impressions they gave the British government. Yes, at the back.
One of the reasons which you discuss in the book, along with the anxiety to not get involved in another war, for the reluctance in Britain to rearm, was that we weren't sure that we could afford it, and there was a lot of wrangling about the budget and where's the money going to come from. So it'd be interesting to know how it was that Nazi Germany, in the midst of the Great Depression, after the catastrophic economic collapse in the Weimar Republic, was able to reboot the economy and suddenly find, presumably massive funds to actually achieve this very rapid rearmament.
Very good question. So the British are absolutely amazed by how the Germans and Adolf Hitler has rebooted the German economy, and this leads to a huge amount of the admiration for the Third Reich, which we were talking about just a second ago. What the British fail to recognize is that Hitler has not really solved unemployment, put 6 million people back to work building autobahns and things like this, which he claims, and giving them all little cars to drive around. They have managed to solve the German economic crisis by putting them into armaments manufacturers, and it's a sort of Keynesianism on heat. Now this is going to burn out, and it is burning out by 1939. The German economy is seriously overheating, and the problem that the Germans have always had is that they don't have enough natural resources. The huge problem on the economic question, which is to the great detriment of the Western powers, is that by 1939 Hitler has signed a deal with Stalin, and all of the natural resources which Germany is missing are now being shipped on a daily basis, not shipped literally because there isn't a sea there, but put on railways and sent to Germany. And the British don't appreciate this. Chamberlain was Chancellor of the Exchequer for the first half of the 1930s. He's a very conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer. We can't possibly start to rearm too much because it will do damage to the normal course of trade. What this rather unimaginative Tory, slightly wedded to laissez-faire but not entirely, fails to realize is that rearmament in Germany boosted the economy and saved the American economy when the Americans started to rearm, and it was the effort to rearm in the Second World War that took America out of the Great Depression, not the New Deal. Yes, sir. But both of you, one after the other. And I think that's probably it. We've got time for.
I just had a couple of questions about Chamberlain's character or his decision-making. Do you think his reputation can be sort of salvaged in any way by what you were saying about the decisions over the Spitfires, the Hurricanes and radar, that he made the right call in targeting a defensive capability when he did? And secondly, are his actions after he loses the premiership in supporting Churchill, does that in some way go towards saving his reputation a little bit?
Yes, I think on both things count towards the sort of pro side of the ledger for Chamberlain. Chamberlain never fought in the First World War, never had an uniform, and it really had a very lousy sense once the war began of strategy. But one thing he absolutely got right when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer was he completely reversed the recommendations of the Defence Requirements Committee. The Defence Requirements Committee said we must rearm a bit, we've got rid of all of our weapons and all of our army since the First World War, and what we're going to have is we're going to have a very large army, a pretty large navy, and hardly any air force. And Chamberlain, not least because this is going to be terribly expensive, says no, we're not going to do that. We're going to have a very large bombing force which can deter a threat from the continent, we're going to have quite a large navy, and we're going to have no army at all. This plays a major part in his downfall because it is the failures of the British Army and the lack of equipment in Norway, and then which bring about his downfall, and then the failures of the British Army in France in May 1940, which the authors of Guilty Men so cite as means of damning his reputation. But I think most military historians would absolutely conclude that Chamberlain was right to prioritise the Air Force. And secondly, the role that Chamberlain played in June 1940 was crucial, and it was an exact switch of what had happened the previous year and a half ago. In the midst of the Czech crisis, there was a middle meeting in between the first meeting at Berchtesgaden and the second meeting at Munich, where the Munich Agreement was signed. The middle meeting happened at Bad Godesberg, and this is where Hitler made yet further demands and wanted to increase the time scale with which he was going to take over Czechoslovakia. And Chamberlain was for giving in here, and Lord Halifax, the previously arch appeaser, suddenly switches sides in the cabinet, and he says, I can't support this. I can't get out of my head that we've given Hitler everything he wants, and he's acting like a bully, and I really think that I can't go along with this anymore. And this stops Chamberlain entirely giving in to Hitler at this stage, and that leads to the brief period where the British really think that they are about to go to war in September 1938. Very interestingly, this is entirely reversed in June 1940. Once the French have been knocked out, or nearing defeat, about to be knocked out of the Second World War, it is Halifax who thinks that we should make some sort of peace overture or find out what sort of armistice could be signed via the Italians, and it is Chamberlain who sides with Churchill, who says that this would be a disaster, and it would have been a disaster because there could have been absolutely no terms which Hitler could have offered us, which we couldn't have rejected. I'm sure even Halifax would have rejected them. I don't think Halifax's detractors would have said that he would have surrendered the British fleet or part of the empire. But the crucial thing is that the Germans would have leaked that we had asked for peace terms. And when you're asking a country to sacrifice every fibre of its entire income and put every fibre of its being into defeating the greatest threat that it's ever faced in its life, you are going to sap all the energy for that if you think that your government is negotiating with the enemy behind your backs. Sorry, last question, sir.
We now know from hindsight that this was the most important issue of the 30s. But in the 30s, at the time, within the nation, how high up the political agenda was it? Were people concerned more about other things, about the standard of life, sort of the abdication crisis, all sorts of things? How much pressure was actually being put onto the top politicians?
Another fantastic question. I don't get the rights to Harold Nicholson's book, so me talking about his diaries is not for my own benefit. But a great quotation from him is during, I think, one of the major German crises. He says, "We all despair. He's at a dinner, and he says, we all agree that the British Empire is in terminal decline. But then we change the subject and start to talk about the two giant pandas that had arrived at London Zoo." So people did think about other things, and certainly they thought about the abdication crisis massively. Most of the population thought about their own living standards, and for an awful lot of people in Britain, Czechoslovakia and indeed these other countries were very far away places of which they knew little. But by September 1938, it was the pressing concern, and most people were aware that a war was highly likely, and there was the public opinion was much more engaged in politics in the 1930s than it had ever been before. 11 million people, 35% of the adult population, took part in what became known as the Peace Ballot in early 1935, which said that they would support sanctions up to and including military sanctions against an aggressor within the auspices of the League of Nations. So there was very, very high involvement among the middle classes and elements of the wider population as to what was going on in the world. And the downside of this was that it convinced the British and the French that, or their political leaders, that public opinion was irredeemably anti-war. But possibly the greatest difference between Winston Churchill and Neville Chamberlain, and what I think defines the difference between a great political leader and slightly less great political leader, is that great political leaders lead public opinion, poor leaders follow it.
Tim, thank you ever so much for that. That was absolutely wonderful, fascinating talk. And thank you everyone for those really insightful questions as well. really added to it. As I said before, Tim will be signing books downstairs in the issue hall if you'd like to buy a copy. Perhaps we could just show our appreciation one more time for Tim.